It's very rare for famous or well-known people to vanish without a trace. But sometimes a person becomes famous due to their unsolved disappearance, attracting attention from across their nation or even around the world in an effort to solve the now famous missing person cases. Number 10. The unsolved disappearance of Andrea Wharton is one that's mixed up in one of Australia's most famous criminal cases. But it's also often overlooked, with the focus being on the cases that Andrea's disappearance may be connected to. Andrea was just 23 years old when she disappeared in 1984. She was the youngest of 3 children and lived in Gold Coast, Queensland. The past 7 years of her life had been difficult, and she'd become connected to people who were dangerous to know. One of those was her boyfriend, Ante Ilavic. The two had met 3 years earlier, and their relationship continued even when Ante was extradited to New South Wales in September to serve time for substance-related crimes. The last time Andrea's family saw her was February 19, 1984. She had an argument with her parents, though the details of that argument have never been revealed. Andrea left, telling them that she was going to see friends at Bryson Bay in New South Wales. A few days after she left, she called her parents and told them that she was still mad. On February 29th, they received a letter apparently sent from Andrea while she was in Darlinghurst, a suburb of Sydney, 8 hours south of Bryson Bay. In it, she apologized for all the grief she had caused, but said she still wasn't ready to come home. Andrea said she was going away for a short while, and 40 years later, Andrea still hasn't returned. Due to Andrea's lifestyle, it wouldn't have been immediately clear that Andrea was actually missing and hadn't just left of her own free will. But as more time passed and Andrea's family couldn't get in touch with her, it was obvious there was a problem. She was reported as a missing person, but there was very little for the police to go off of. It later emerged that she'd actually taken a flight straight to Sydney, where her boyfriend was living. The police believed that she had no intention of going to Bryson Bay at all. Darlinghurst, where the letter had been sent from, was a relatively dangerous area at the time. There were some leads that Andrea may have been talking to some of the criminals who lived in the area, but it was difficult to get any concrete information. 19 months after Andrea vanished, so did Ilavic. The police believed that the two disappearances were connected, but not that Ilavic was responsible for his girlfriend's disappearance. Ilavic was last seen on September 2, 1985, leaving his parents' home. He was going to see a man named John Anderson. Anderson had an extensive criminal record, including offenses related to illegal substances but also violent crimes. He's also the suspect in a number of cases against women and may have been involved in the disappearance of Trudy Adams. If alive today, Andrea would be 63 years old. She's described as being 5 foot 3 inches tall with a slim build, fair hair and hazel eyes. She has an appendix scar and a scar over her right eyebrow. Anyone with information in this case should contact Crime Stoppers at 1-800-333-000. Number 9. The disappearance of Jim Thompson is one of the most famous unsolved disappearances in Malaysian history. Countless conspiracy theories have been developed over the years, but there are still no clues as to what happened to the American businessman. By the time Jim disappeared in 1967, he was best known for revitalizing the Thai silk industry. He'd served in Thailand during the Second World War and moved back there after being discharged. He started the Thai Silk Company alongside George Barry a few years later, and the company went from strength to strength. Away from business, Jim collected antiques and created a museum to display his collection. He was also very social, hosting guests that included world leaders, movie stars, and entertainers. He was also known for having a complicated love life, which may have involved the wives of other men. But Jim also had a secret. During the war, he'd been part of the Office of Strategic Services, a precursor to the CIA. He officially left the service after the war, but his previous position only led to more speculation when he eventually disappeared. Jim had been living in Thailand for over 20 years when he vanished. Over the Easter weekend in 1967, he and a few friends traveled to Malaysia to stay with others at a cottage in the Cameron Highlands region. The region is mostly known for its thick jungle and high altitude. It was easy to get lost, especially for someone unfamiliar with the area. The day before Jim's disappearance, he and a friend went for a walk in the wilderness, only to get lost and have to spend a considerable amount of time trying to find their way back. That didn't stop Jim from going off and exploring again the following day. On Sunday, March 26th, Jim and his friends woke early to go to a church service. Before the service, Jim went off briefly on his own for a walk, but was back in time for church and a lunch with his friends. It was around 1:30 p.m. when he left for a second time, this time never to be seen again. Jim's friends expected that he would be back within a few hours, and when this didn't happen, they alerted authorities and a search began. One of the most extensive land searches in Malaysian history would take place over the next 11 days. As well as local Malay and Thai police, the Malaysian, British, and US Army were also involved in the search. Boy Scouts and indigenous native trackers, and over 100 local mystics took part. The search included people who were very experienced with this territory, and who would be used to carry out search and rescue operations in difficult locations. But even with hundreds of people searching and thousands of man-hours spent in the forest, no sign of Jim was ever found. There was also the possibility that Jim had been kidnapped, although no ransom was ever demanded. Some also suspected Jim's business rivals might have had something to do with the disappearance. The problem with most of these theories was that there simply was no evidence. A more plausible theory suggested that Jim got lost in the forest and had some kind of medical emergency. Even with the number of people who were searching, it was possible that something could have been missed, and he may still be out there, over 50 years later, waiting to be found. Number 8. Melvin Gamblin was an avid sports fan who traveled around the world to watch the likes of the Olympics and the Rugby World Cup. But after one of these trips, Melvin didn't return home, and he hasn't been seen or heard from since. Melvin was 37 years old at the time of his disappearance. He had traveled alone from his home in northern England to Athens to watch the 2004 Olympics. The games were something he was passionate about. Melvin had been to the last 4 Olympics, which had taken him as far away as Australia and North America. A trip to Greece was relatively short, and should have been simple for such a well-traveled individual. Melvin had tickets to the swimming, athletics, and rowing, but tried to pack as many sports into his trip as possible. He spent most of August in Greece. His trip occasionally overlapped with those of friends from his home in Darlington. One friend recalled how Melvin slept for less than an hour some nights, as he wanted to catch both the early morning and late night events. Throughout the trip, he sent emails and text messages back to his family in England. It seemed like he was enjoying himself, and they had no reason to believe he wouldn't be home at the end of the summer. The last time his family heard from him was August 28th, the day before the closing ceremony of the Games. He was in good spirits and had just watched the 4x100 meter relay, where Great Britain had won the gold. Melvin had planned to stay in Greece for a few extra days, and his flight home was booked for September 3rd. It wasn't until he missed this flight that his family began to realize that something was wrong. Nobody was able to get in touch with Melvin, and the search for the missing individual began. The police discovered that the last confirmed sighting of the missing Brit was at the hotel where he'd been staying. He was actually seen on September 3rd, the day he was supposed to check out and fly home. He left the hotel without properly checking out and left most of his luggage behind too. Since then, there have been few unconfirmed sightings of Melvin on various Greek islands, but the potential leads led nowhere. Melvin's family believed his medical condition was a factor in his disappearance. He suffered from ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome. Most of the time, it didn't disrupt his life too much, but he could go through episodes when things were really bad. When he was at home, he would sleep at least 10 hours a day. His family believed the lack of sleep while he was in Athens could have made his condition worse and possibly sent him into a depression. Melvin had had episodes before and always kept in touch with his family. The fact that he hadn't called or texted them was extremely worrying, and they didn't believe this was a normal relapse. A strange clue came a few weeks after Melvin vanished, when a photo of him taken in Athens was mailed to his home in England. It didn't come with a note or any kind of explanation. It was possible to determine that Melvin hadn't been the one to take the photo, and it seems likely that someone else had had the photo developed and sent back to Melvin, perhaps not even knowing he was missing. The photo, like the potential sightings, didn't lead the police any closer to Melvin. Melvin's family continued to hope that he is still alive somewhere in Greece, even years after he vanished without a trace. They still hope to get answers to his strange case. Melvin is described as being 5 foot 10 inches tall, of a medium build, and had short brown hair when he vanished. He also wears glasses. Anybody with information can contact Durham Constabulary on 101 or the Missing People Charity at 116-000. Number 7. In the summer of July 1890, a man going by the name Johan Orth sailed away from port in Argentina, never to be heard from again. Johan was a member of the Austrian imperial family, and his disappearance was shocking. Johan was born Johann Salvator, the younger son of the Archduke of Tuscany, and a member of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine. Italian unification led to the Archduke rescinding his power and moving the family to Austria, where the main branch of the family was still in power. As the younger son, it was expected for him to go into the military, and Johan did. But he wasn't too obedient, and his more liberal attitudes caused strife between him and the emperor, Franz Joseph. Even though he didn't get on with the head of the house, Johan was a good friend of the Crown Prince Rudolf. Rudolf shared his more liberal views, and the two worked together to try to combat spiritualism and mystics, who they believed to be frauds. Johan also spoke out about the state of the education system in Austria, and about the Austrian military. The entire family, and the nation as a whole, was shocked when the Crown Prince lost his life in 1889. Officially, the strife with his father had caused him to take his own life, but Johan suspected that foul play may have been involved. Without his close friend, Johan would have been alone as the more liberally minded person in his family. Not long after Rudolf passed away, Johan decided he was going to find his own way out from the family. He renounced his titles, lands, and any rights that being a royal afforded him. He changed his name from Johann Salvator to Johan Orth, taking the name of the castle that he'd recently been given as his own. Johan almost immediately went to England, where he married his longtime lover, who was an opera ballet dancer and someone his family greatly disapproved of. In 1889, he purchased the ship, the Sainte Marguerite, with plans to go into business shipping cargo. He traveled to South America with his young wife and started shipping cement cargo. In February of 1890, the two were aboard the Sainte Marguerite when they left Uruguay en route to Chile. The last time the ship or anybody aboard was seen was on the 12th of July in Cape Tres Puntas in Argentina. The journey would have taken them south around the Cape Horn and into the Pacific Ocean. This stretch of sea is particularly dangerous, and many ships have vanished without a trace during the near constant storms in the region. When neither the Sainte Marguerite or any of her crew were seen again, it was assumed this is what happened. It was another 2 decades before Johan was officially classed as having passed away, with little hope of ever even recovering his body. But that didn't stop people from coming forward decades later to claim that they were the lost Duke. Most of these were dismissed as frauds or stories the claimant had invented, but in some cases, there was enough to make people investigate the claim. Shortly before passing away, a man named Orloff Orlo claimed to be the lost Duke. He was a teacher of Eastern esotericism who'd moved to New York from California. He first surfaced in Chicago in 1899 and claimed he'd traveled around Asia to gain his knowledge. When he was about to pass away, he confessed to having been Johann Salvator. Another claimant was a German-born lithographer living in Norway named Alexander Kohler. Kohler claimed he'd purchased the identity from the real Alexander Kohler in 1888 and swapped places with the commoner. So far, neither of these claims have been proven as true, and it seems more likely that Johan disappeared at sea, along with the rest of the Sainte Marguerite. Number 6. Linda Rose Grimm was just 25 years old when she vanished without a trace. Over the next 18 months, her mother received periodic calls from Linda, but something about the calls seemed off. When the calls stopped altogether, it was clear that something was wrong. Unfortunately, considering how strange this missing person case is, there isn't a lot of information about who Linda was. She was married, and some sources say that she had a cesarean scar, but there's no information about any kind of family she might have had. Some sources claim that she'd been in a strained relationship with her husband, but there are also no details about why that might have been. The last time Linda was seen was on or around the 31st of March, 1986. Even the details of this last sighting are confusing, with sources varying about who the last person to see her was, or even when the last sighting was. The most common version of events is that Linda was last seen by her mother on March 31st. She left her home in Paris, California to purchase a pack of cigarettes, and Linda never returned and she was reported missing soon after. Some sources claim that she went missing on April 1st, or even April 1st, 1985. It's also sometimes stated that her husband was the last person to see her. Over the next 18 months, Linda's mother received phone calls that she believed were from her daughter. During the calls, Linda sounded nervous and didn't give her mother detailed information. It sounded like she was trying to reassure her that she was okay, but she wouldn't tell her where she was or why she had left. The calls were sporadic, and it wasn't possible to predict when they would come. It was impossible to know whether the next call would be the last as well. Linda's final contact with her mother was in October of 1987. She told her mother she was in Wichita, Kansas, and was staying on a farm with a truck driver named Robert Masters. The calls were far from reassuring, and Linda remained classified as a missing person. About 2 years after she was last heard from, her car was located in the parking lot of a supermarket in Huntington Beach, California. The location was only around an hour and a half's drive from Linda's home. It's unclear how long the car was there before it was discovered, but it's unlikely that it had been there the entire time that Linda was missing. The car offered no clues as to what had happened to her. No new information has been uncovered since Linda went missing. It's not known who, if anybody, is still looking for her. If she were alive today, Linda would be 62 years old. She was described as being 5 foot 2 inches tall and weighed 100 pounds. She drove a yellow Ford Pinto. She had brown hair and eyes, and a white mole on her nose near her left eye. Anyone with information about this case should contact the Orange County Sheriff's Department at 714-647-7000. Number 5. Edward L. Mon Toro was a movie producer and distributor responsible for the likes of Grizzly and Beyond the Door. But after a series of problems in his personal and professional life, Mon Toro disappeared, taking with him over $1 million embezzled from his company's accounts. Mon Toro was born in Cleveland in 1936 and tried his hand at a few professions, but his real love was for flying. He wanted to be an airline pilot. A nasty accident in 1968 cut that dream short, and Mon Toro had to look at other professions. A few years after the accident, Mon Toro tried his hand at filmmaking for the first time. He directed the adult comedy film Getting Into Heaven, which was a financial success. Mon Toro then started up the business Film Ventures International, which focused on film distribution rather than production. Most of the films that FVI distributed were brought to the US from overseas, usually from Italy. Mon Toro didn't show much loyalty to one particular genre. He wanted films that would appeal to a large audience. These were usually horror films or spaghetti westerns. The first major success the company had was with the film Beyond the Door. The film was a supernatural horror about a housewife who became possessed by a demonic entity. The film made $15 million, but also attracted the attention of Warner Brothers. For the company, it seemed a little too similar to The Exorcist. Despite any similarities, FVI won the suit, and Beyond the Door continued to be distributed. A few years later, FVI was responsible for financing and distributing the film Grizzly. Like Beyond the Door, this was another film that was derivative of an already successful movie. This time, the film was leaning on the movie Jaws. The film featured a giant bear in the place of a shark attacking campers. Grizzly was a major success and became the highest-grossing independent movie up until that point. FVI would never have the same success, but it did continue to make money distributing other films along the same themes. It was one of these that marked the beginning of the end for FVI, and may have led to Mon Toro's mysterious disappearance. Great White was another Italian-produced film that FVI had acquired the rights to distribute. Mon Toro believed the film would be a big success, and spent millions of dollars promoting it. But as soon as it was released in theaters, Warner Brothers took them to court. The film actually used footage from the movie Jaws, and the courts sided in Warner Brothers' favor. Even after this, FBI continued to function, but now Montoro's personal life was also having problems. He was hospitalized with a serious illness. After his release, friends noticed that there seemed to be a shift in his personality. He started wearing suits and seemed much more serious. Around the same time, Montoro's wife filed for a divorce. If it went through, she would have taken control of half of FBI, which Montoro wanted to avoid at all costs. In early 1983, Montoro disappeared with just his car and the money he had stolen from FBI. He left behind debts to other companies that FBI had worked with, as well as employees who needed to be paid. Also left behind were his boat, house, and other possessions. Montoro is believed to have fled to Mexico, but what happened after that is a mystery. If alive today, he would be 84 years old. Number 4. The disappearance of Branson Perry is one of the most famous unsolved missing person cases in recent years. Branson disappeared after walking away from his home in Skidmore, Missouri in 2001. Despite numerous tips and searches over the years, no trace of Branson has ever been found. It was on April 11, 2001, when the 20-year-old was last seen. Branson was living with his father, Bob, at the time. After leaving school, he'd worked as a roofer and then helped out at a traveling petting zoo, but he was recently unemployed. Branson's father was in the hospital at the time of his disappearance, and Branson and a friend had come together to help clean up the house and get it ready for Bob's return. Also at the house were a pair of mechanics who were working on Bob's car outside. The friend recalled Branson taking something from a cabinet and leaving the house for a short while before returning. The friend never found out what it was or where Branson took it. A little while later, around 3 p.m., Branson left again. This time, his friend managed to catch him before he went to ask where he was going and what he was doing. Branson said he was going to take some jumper cables to a shed, but he would never return. Neither the friend nor the mechanics knew where Branson went. The following day, Branson's grandmother went to visit Bob in the hospital and discovered that her grandson hadn't come to visit him the previous day. She went to check on the house, only to find the front door unlocked. When Bob was released from the hospital, Branson was reported as a missing person, and the search began. Branson had left all his personal belongings back at the house. The jumper cables he had taken with him were also missing at first. During the initial search of the shed, they were nowhere to be seen. Shortly afterward, a second search turned up the cables on the ground near the door. It's not clear if they'd simply been missed in the initial search, or if someone had moved and placed them there. There were a few potential suspects in Branson's case, including a friend who he'd been to see a few days before he vanished. But there was never any evidence that they had anything to do with Branson's disappearance. In 2003, Jack Wayne Rogers was arrested for assault and practicing medicine without a license. During the investigation, the police discovered that Rogers had written on message boards about picking up a hitchhiker and taking his life, before burying the remains in the Ozarks. The description of the hitchhiker matched the description of Branson. Rogers denied all knowledge of Branson and claimed that the post had been a fantasy and a work of fiction. The missing person case has now become famous and is well known both across the US and around the world. If alive today, Branson would be 43 years old. Anybody with information in this case is asked to contact the Nottoway County Sheriff's Office at 660-582-7451. Number 3. On July 16, 1996, Susan Walsh dropped off her son with her estranged husband. She was only supposed to be gone for half an hour, but she would never return. Her missing person case became a famous unsolved mystery. Despite plenty of media attention, her case is still unanswered today. Susan had always wanted to be a writer and study English and writing at William Peterson University. To help pay her way through college, she became an exotic dancer. It was a career she enjoyed when she first started, but she later admitted she started to hate the work and the customers. She graduated from university in 1984 and began to work as a freelance journalist. Around the same time, she married Mark Walsh, and the two had a son together in 1988. Unfortunately, the relationship broke down, and by 1996, the two were living separately. Susan's most famous, or infamous, work was as a journalist working for the Village Voice, an alternative bi-weekly newspaper. Her first big story was about the Russian mafia and its influence on the type of clubs that Susan had previously worked in. It caused the club owners to side with their dancers against the mob and put Susan in a dangerous situation. Susan didn't seem to be put off by the attention at first and continued her work. The next major story she focused on concerned a vampire movement that was growing in nightclubs in New York City. Most of the people simply dressed in gothic fashion, but some claimed that they consumed the life force of others or actually fed like vampires. Some claimed to have taken the lives of their victims in order to feed. Susan became fascinated by the culture and dated a few people who claimed to be vampires. The Village Voice decided not to publish her story on the movement, as the editor thought it wasn't impartial enough. Meanwhile, Susan had been telling her friends that she believed she had a stalker. According to one ex-boyfriend, she'd confided in him that she knew her stalker was another ex-boyfriend who'd done some work for the mob before. At first, friends thought she might just be being paranoid, but then they also witnessed some of the stalking behavior. Susan was struggling to make ends meet as a writer and turned back to dancing to make some extra money. It wasn't something she was enjoying, but it did mean she could help friends with primary research for books and a documentary on the industry. A lot was going on in Susan's life when she disappeared. She was worried for her safety, presumably due to her article on the mob. But she was also struggling to manage medical conditions. She had bipolar disorder and was struggling with mood swings and depression in the months before she vanished. But none of her friends could have predicted that she would disappear without a trace. When Susan disappeared, her previous work meant that the missing person case attracted news headlines. All her belongings had been left at her apartment, including her wallet and pager. Interestingly, the entire month of July had been ripped from the calendar in Susan's home. The police first interviewed her estranged husband, but concluded that he wasn't a person of interest in the case. No person of interest has ever been named. Some believe that Susan may have intentionally disappeared, but her family do not think she would have willingly left behind her son. Over the decades, the police have reinvestigated the case, but no new clues appear to have emerged. Susan was just 36 years old when she vanished. She's described as being 5 foot 6 inches tall and weighed 110 pounds. Anyone with information in the case should contact the Nutley Police Department on 973-284-4940. Number 2. Arthur Craven would describe himself as the mysterious Arthur Craven when he entered the boxing ring before matches. But there is nothing more mysterious about the poet-boxer than his unsolved disappearance in 1918. Craven was born in Switzerland to English parents in 1887. His aunt was married to the famous writer Oscar Wilde, and he was the grandson of the Privy Councillor Horace Lloyd. But as Craven came of age, that connection to Oscar Wilde wasn't something that his family were proud of. They changed their surnames to distance themselves from the writer. Craven also changed his name, but abandoned his birth name entirely to become Arthur Craven. Craven spent most of his adult life traveling. He was a poet, but his writing wasn't what could typically be expected. The Dada movement wouldn't take hold for another few years, but what Craven created could be considered proto-Dadaism and performance art. It was eccentric and a critique of the way art was being consumed at the time. He also created a magazine to promote his writing and the ventures of his friends, while criticizing other artists and locations. When the Second World War began, Craven realized he had to flee to Europe. He was technically a British citizen and could be conscripted into the army. Craven told friends that he wasn't a conscientious objector, but he simply wasn't going to sacrifice his own life for the war. He made his way to Barcelona, where there were many other artists, poets, and philosophers who were all trying to find a way across the Atlantic. Craven earned money in a boxing match and sailed across the Atlantic to Mexico on the same ship as Leon Trotsky. From there, he made his way to New York, where Craven resumed a similar life to what he'd had in Europe. He mixed with artistic crowds and met poet and writer Mina Loy. The two had a whirlwind romance, but when the United States entered the war, Craven had to flee again. He traveled first to Canada and then made his way to Mexico. Loy joined him there, but they had a difficult time. They had little income, and Craven was being sought after by the U.S. secret police for dodging the draft. On top of that, Craven fell ill, which only made it more difficult for them to survive. When Loy fell pregnant, they realized they needed to change their living situation. Craven still didn't have the papers he would need to move legally, so the couple came up with another plan. Loy would travel to Argentina on a Japanese passenger ship, and Craven would later join her. He had a few friends in Mexico who were also looking to travel further south, and they would go together. Craven purchased a small fishing vessel that needed repair work. After completing the necessary repairs, he took the boat out in late October. The plan was to only go a short way down the coast, possibly just to test the repairs, or to trade the boat in and get a bigger vessel. Craven was never seen or heard from again. There was plenty of speculation about what might have happened to him. The obvious answer was that the boat capsized and Craven didn't survive his trip. The weather would have been particularly windy at that time of year, and Craven wasn't an experienced sailor. But others believed that he might have faked the incident and gone into hiding. Some believe that he may have resurfaced years later as a mysterious Oscar Wilde forger who was never identified, or that he simply disappeared to live an ordinary life away from the responsibilities of a wife and child. Over 100 years since he was last seen, it's likely we'll never know the answer. Number 1. The disappearance of Shelly Miscavage is one of the most disturbing unsolved missing person cases in recent years. What makes Shelly's unexplained disappearance that much creepier is the fact that there appears to be an entire organization keeping the truth about what happened to her hidden. For years, Shelly was one of the most well-known faces of Scientology. She'd been involved in the organization since she was a child, and was able to get close to founder L. Ron Hubbard as a messenger. She was also close to other people who were rising up the ranks, and when she was 21, she married David Miscavage. When Miscavige took the reins as the leader of the Church of Scientology, Shelly was at his side as an assistant. She had power over other church members and wasn't afraid to use it. But she was also described as being generous and for calming down her husband's anger. She also allegedly had a hand in selecting partners for Scientology's most famous follower, Tom Cruise. But in 2006, Shelly quickly fell from grace. She had taken on the project of reorganizing an organizational board of key staff, while her husband was out of town. It was a project that many people had tried and failed in the past. Shelly not only failed to do something that he'd found satisfactory, but she had also done so without permission. Shelly was rarely seen in public after this. The last known public outing came in August of 2007, when she attended her father's funeral. Even before this, people had started to ask questions about Shelly. Among those were Shelly's friend and fellow Scientologist, Leah Remini. In November of 2006, Cruise married Katie Holmes, in what was a major event for the church. Leah and her husband were invited, but Leah was surprised to see that Shelly wasn't present. When she asked where Shelly was, Leah immediately shut down, and was told that she wasn't of a high enough rank to ask those questions. Leah began to question the church more and more, and finally left in 2013. Days after leaving the church, she filed a missing person report with the LA Police Department. The missing person case was closed within a few days. The police arranged a meeting with someone claiming to be Shelly Miscavige. They had to negotiate where to meet her, eventually settling on a cafe where she appeared with a lawyer with a history of working for the church. The woman showed an ID and gave fingerprints to the police officers, but wasn't actually informed that a missing person report had been filed for her. The police seemed happy to confirm that this woman was Shelly Miscavige, even though the fingerprints came back inconclusive, and it seemed as if the person who gave them had been trained to make the fingerprints unreadable. The case was closed, but for many people, Shelly remains missing. After reporting that the missing person report was unfounded, the police went back to the cafe to collect CCTV footage of the meeting, but it had somehow been scrambled and was useless. Leah Remini continues to ask questions about what happened to her friend. There are a few theories about where Shelly may be today. According to the Church of Scientology, she's simply keeping out of the public eye and is doing work for the church. Some former members of the church have come forward to say that they believe she's being held against her will in a compound. It's also possible that she's choosing to be there. David Miscavige has also retreated from the public in recent years due to a series of lawsuits filed against him. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.